Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. As expected, India has secured a near unanimous victory during elections to the non-permanent seat at the UN Security Council. So in this context, let us understand the role, functions and significance of the UN Security Council and as well as its shortcomings. Then let us also talk about the contributions that India can make to the UN Security Council as a non-permanent member. See, the UN Security Council is one of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations, and it happens to be the most powerful organ of the UN. Its mandate is to promote international peace and security, and as a part of this mandate, the UNSC enjoys a set of extraordinary powers. Under these extraordinary powers, the UN Security Council can authorize the use of military force against a country. For example, when Afghanistan was invaded by the international peacekeeping forces in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks, the mission had to be authorized by the UN Security Council. The UNSC can also impose sanctions, including economic sanctions against a country. For example, the sanctions that are applicable against North Korea illustrates how the UNSC can act against countries that are threatening international peace and security. The UNSC is also the decision-making body for the deployment of UN peacekeeping forces, and it also has the powers to control and coordinate all UN peacekeeping missions. Then upon this, the UNSC can debate global issues that are affecting international peace and security, and it can adopt resolutions that are binding on all the members of the United Nations. Take for example, the UN Security Council Resolution number 1267, which mandates all UN members to place sanctions against terrorists belonging to the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda, who have been listed as global terrorists by the 1267 Sanctions Committee. These are the kind of extraordinary powers that make the UNSC the most powerful organ of the UN, and these powers are enjoyed by an elite club of countries. The UNSC is made up of 15 countries, which includes 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members. The permanent members, or the P5, includes the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia and China, and they enjoy the veto power. This gives them the power to block any debate or block any resolution, making the P5 countries all the more elite and powerful within the UN Security Council. Then apart from the P5 members, there are 10 non-permanent members who are elected on a rotational basis for 2-year terms on the basis of geographical quotas. That is, these 10 non-permanent seats are divided for various geographic regions such as Africa, Asia Pacific, etc. Based on this geographical assignment, India gets to contest under the Asia Pacific category, and it has been elected nearly unanimously for the 8th term by securing 184 votes out of the 192 legitimate votes in the UN General Assembly. So this has secured India a non-permanent seat at the UN Security Council for the 2021-22 period. But as you can see, there is a clear imbalance of power between the P5 and the 10 non-permanent members. While the P5 get to enjoy the veto right, no such rights and powers have been given to the non-permanent members. This makes these 5 countries extremely powerful, and it allows them to take key decisions at the UN Security Council that can impact global peace and security. But in contrast, the 10 non-permanent members have been given only nominal powers as compared to the P5, and essentially these 5 countries get to make decisions on behalf of all the 193 member states of the UN. But even though the non-permanent members have been given only nominal powers, they do get to play a key role during debates at the UN Security Council. These non-permanent members even get to set the agenda for discussions at the UN Security Council when they occupy the presidency of the UNSC. See, as per the UN Charter, presidency of the UNSC rotates on a monthly basis amongst the 15 members of the UN Security Council. The presidency of the UNSC rotates on a monthly basis amongst the 5 permanent and 10 non-permanent members on the basis of the English alphabetical order. So this means that even the non-permanent members get to hold the presidency of the UNSC for at least 2 months during their 2-year tenure. So this allows the non-permanent member to set the agenda for discussion at the UNSC, and this allows the non-permanent member to play a key role in global geopolitics. After having held the non-permanent seat for 7 terms in the past, India was looking to get elected for the 8th term and hold the non-permanent seat for the 2021-22 period. In order to secure this victory, India had launched a global campaign to gain the support of UN members in order to secure the two-third majority that is needed to win the non-permanent seat at the UN Security Council. See, elections to the non-permanent seat at the UNSC is held at the UN General Assembly through secret ballot, and a member country which is seeking to represent its geographical region needs to secure at least two-thirds of the votes of the total membership of the UN General Assembly. As a result of its global campaign, India has managed to secure a near unanimous victory, and because of the diplomatic goodwill that India enjoys, it managed to secure nearly 184 votes out of the 192 legitimate votes. So this allows India to occupy a non-permanent seat at the UN Security Council for 2021-22, and it allows India to play a key role in global geopolitics. As an upcoming non-permanent member, India has already made its objectives and priorities very clear. India is looking to promote a multilateral global solution to battle the COVID-19 pandemic. It is looking to enhance global action against terrorism by pushing for the adoption of the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism. And it is also looking to push for reforms at multilateral institutions, including reforms at the United Nations, through an acronym known as NORMS that has been coined by India's Foreign Minister Mr. Jaishankar. NORMS stands for New Orientation for a Reformed Multilateral System. And this happens to be India's initiative to reform the multilateral world order, including much needed reforms of the United Nations, which has become an outdated organization. See, when we spoke about the dominance of the UNSC at the United Nations and the imbalance of power between the P5 and the non-permanent members within the UNSC, it made us realize the flaws that exist with regard to the design, structure, composition, mandate, and the powers of the United Nations. India and a few other like-minded countries have long argued that the UN is an outdated organization, and hence they have been pushing for wide-sweeping reforms at the UN. So India has made it clear that as a non-permanent member, it would like to push this initiative forward, and it would look to raise the call for reforming the United Nations under its NORMS initiative. Next, on page number 6, we have an editorial which analyzes India's election to the UN Security Council under the non-permanent category and examines the priorities for India and the responsibilities of India when it gets to occupy this prestigious position at the international high table. See, the editorial calls this development a major diplomatic victory for India because it gives an opportunity for India to push the cause for UN reforms. See, over the last 1 year, when India was campaigning with other countries in order to get elected from the Asia Pacific region, its campaign had centered around 3 to 4 issues, which pretty much sums up the issues faced by the United Nations. See, even though the United Nations was the most important multilateral institution that was constituted after the Second World War, its relevance and its performance has been affected due to its flawed design and flawed structure. India and a few other countries have long insisted that the United Nations, especially the UN Security Council, does not reflect current geopolitical realities. By restricting the veto power to the P5 countries and by restricting non-permanent membership to just 10 countries, the structure of the UN has failed to give representation to emerging economic and military powers such as India, Germany, Japan, Brazil, South Africa, Mexico, Indonesia, etc. By making the UNSC an elite club and by making the P5 extremely powerful, the UN Charter has allowed the P5 countries to dominate global affairs. By making the UNSC a select club, the UN Charter has allowed the UNSC to dominate the UN General Assembly, which has universal membership. The structure and design of the United Nations and its bodies have allowed the P5 countries to misuse their powers in order to pursue their respective geopolitical national interests, even at the cost of compromising on global interests. So, in order to address this structural anomaly within the United Nations, especially within the UNSC, India and a few other like-minded countries, such as Germany, Japan and Brazil, have raised the call to reform the United Nations. These 4 countries have even formed an informal grouping known as the G4 in order to push for UN reforms. So while campaigning for the non-permanent seat, India made this a key agenda and it plans to push the topic of UN reforms at the UNSC. Because if the power imbalance between the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly has to be corrected, and if the power imbalance between the P5 and the non-permanent members of the UNSC has to be corrected, then the UN Charter has to be amended, which can be done only with the consent of the P5. So as a non-permanent member, India would look forward to work on these issues by tying up with like-minded countries such as Germany, Japan, Brazil, etc. Then also note that the push for UN reforms by the G4 is opposed by their respective regional rivals such as Pakistan, Italy, Argentina, etc., which have also formed an informal group known as the Coffee Club or the UFC or the United for Consensus, which is opposed to the G4. So as a non-permanent member, India would be looking to live up to its campaign promise and promote the cause of multilateralism by pushing for reforms at the United Nations. India would also look to make use of this opportunity to promote greater transparency with regard to UN peacekeeping missions. Because see, right now, the deployment of UN peacekeeping forces and the control over UN peacekeeping missions is completely exercised by the UN Security Council, which basically means that the P5 countries have unilateral control over UN peacekeeping missions. Countries like India, which have always been one of the largest troop contributing countries to the UN peacekeeping forces, have opposed this excessive control of the P5 over UN peacekeeping missions, and they have called for greater transparency and greater involvement of the troop contributing countries in the decision-making process as well. So the issue of bringing greater transparency with regard to UN peacekeeping missions would be high on India's priority as a non-permanent member. Then upon this, India would also like to make use of this opportunity to push for the adoption of the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism. This Comprehensive Convention Against Terrorism was introduced at the United Nations in 1996 with India's leadership, and it seeks to criminalize all forms of terrorism, and it seeks to deny terrorists and terror groups access to funds, access to safe havens, and it seeks to impose penalties on state sponsors of terrorism. But despite India's best efforts, the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism has not been adopted by the United Nations due to opposition from various countries. Countries such as Pakistan, China and their allies feel that this convention pushed by India has been designed to target Pakistan. This convention has also been opposed by a few Western countries and by few countries in Africa and in Latin America because they feel that the provisions of the convention could lead to violation of human rights. But despite these objections, over the last 24 years, India has been looking to raise diplomatic support for the convention, and it would look to create sufficient support for the convention to be adopted while it holds the non-permanent seat at the UN Security Council. Apart from this, India would look to gain broader support for reforming the UN and its institutions, and particularly for expanding and reforming the UN Security Council. Then apart from these primary objectives, India will also have to deal with current geopolitical issues. See, the COVID-19 pandemic has already shaken up the global world order. Plus tensions between global powers such as United States, China, Russia, etc. have increased consistently, and wars, conflict and unrest in countries such as Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, etc. have deepened over the last few years. So as a non-permanent member, India would be forced to make a choice on such contentious geopolitical issues, and hence the editorial says that it would be very important for India to appear neutral and to not to be seen taking sides on these geopolitical issues. The editorial says that instead of siding with any single side for short-term geopolitical gains, India should be mindful of its long-term strategic goals, and hence it should push towards reviving multilateralism and provide neutral leadership that is driven by the traditional values that India has stood for, instead of being driven by narrow geopolitical objectives. So essentially, the editorial is asking India to adopt value-based positions on such contentious geopolitical issues. Next, the editorial is asking India to make use of its position as a non-permanent member to lead and represent the non-P5 members of the UN and provide a voice to the weaker countries and emerge as a champion for South-South cooperation. See, in the field of geopolitics and international relations, the terms Global North and Global South are frequently used. Global North refers to the developed countries, whereas the term Global South refers to the developing and underdeveloped countries. And any cooperation amongst these developing and underdeveloped countries is referred to as South-South cooperation. Since independence, India has emerged as a champion of South-South cooperation. For example, in the 1950s, India extended support to anti-colonial movements across Africa. Then it took up the cause of nuclear disarmament through the introduction of the Convention on Nuclear Disarmament at the United Nations. Then, with regard to climate change negotiations at the UNFCCC, India gave a voice to the underdeveloped countries through groupings such as the G77, IBSA, BASIC, etc. So the editorial is calling upon India to make use of its position as a non-permanent member of the UNSC to further strengthen its position as a leader of South-South cooperation by leading and representing the other non-P5 countries and by providing a voice to the weaker nations. Now let's take up another editorial from page number 6, which analyzes the consistent hike in fuel prices by the public sector oil marketing companies of India. See, over the last 12 days, oil prices, that is the retail prices of petrol and diesel, have been hiked consistently by the state-owned oil marketing companies. So in this context, the editorial is trying to analyze the reasons behind this price hike and its impact on the consumer. See, the repeated hike of fuel prices in India is not consistent with the global trend, because global oil prices have been declining and they have even hit a historic low as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and nationwide lockdowns around the world. Take for example Brent crude, which is a key oil pricing index that accounts for nearly 25% of the value of Indian crude basket, has declined by about 3%, whereas oil prices in India have been increased consistently by the oil marketing companies. The only possible explanation for this lies with the intention of the government to raise revenue by capitalizing on low global oil prices, which allows the government to raise additional revenue through imposition of higher duties and taxes. See, data shows that nearly 2/3 or 75% of the price that we pay for petrol or diesel is constituted of government duties and taxes, such as the excise duty imposed by the Government of India and VAT or value added tax imposed by the state governments. So the actual cost of petrol or diesel is just 25% of the retail price that we pay. The editorial says that oil marketing companies have been increasing prices over the last few days at the insistence of the government, and this places an unfair burden on the consumer and on private transport. See, when it comes to retail oil pricing, the prices were regulated prior to 2010. Especially with regard to pricing of diesel, the government used to directly intervene, considering the significance of diesel for the agrarian and industrial economy. But post 2010, the government adopted the policy of deregulation of prices, and it allowed the oil marketing companies to fix the price of petrol and diesel on a daily basis. This was a sound economic policy because the government was stepping away from the regulation of oil prices and it was allowing the market factors to take over. But of late, especially after the pandemic, it appears that the government has become desperate to raise its revenue, and it has consistently increased excise duty and VAT on petrol and diesel, which pushes the oil marketing companies to hike the prices as well. But the editorial says that the desire of the government to raise additional revenue by imposing higher duties and taxes is illogical, because as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown, economic activity has slowed down, and this has brought down the consumption of petrol and especially diesel. Since agriculture, industrial activities, manufacturing and logistics is directly dependent on diesel, its consumption has gone down because the lockdown has affected all these sectors of the economy. So the government's desire to increase revenue by imposing higher taxes will not be fulfilled because the consumption of diesel itself has gone down as a result of slowdown in the economic activities. So the editorial says that the hike in taxes and the hike in prices is only going to place an unfair burden on private transport, especially at a time when dependency on private transport has increased because public transport remains suspended as a result of the pandemic. So in this context, the editorial is asking the government and the oil marketing companies to keep the prices of petrol and diesel in line with the global oil prices in order to revive economic activity and reduce the burden on the consumer and as well as on private transport. Now let's take up an article from page number 7 in which two eminent professors evaluate the impact of the nationalistic call for boycotting Chinese products as a response to increasing border tensions and border conflicts with China. See, as China's border aggression has increased and as the negative public perception of China has increased within India, there has been an unofficial call to boycott Chinese products. This is being seen as a nationalistic response in order to protect the Indian economy and reduce its dependency on the Chinese economy and impose a cost on China for its aggressive and bullying tactics that it has adopted against India. So this article evaluates whether is it possible for India to decouple itself from Chinese manufacturing and reduce the dependency of the Indian economy on the Chinese economy. See, India and China share a highly unequal trading relationship, and this becomes apparent when you look at the trade deficit that is in China's favor. See, if you look at the trading volume between the two countries for 2019-20, total bilateral trade stood at $81 billion. Out of this, Indian imports from China accounted for a massive $65 billion, clearly indicating that India has a massive trade deficit with China. So addressing this imbalance in trade is definitely an economic imperative for India, but the question is, should it be done as a nationalistic response? The question is it really practical for India to immediately end its dependency on Chinese manufacturing? See, by looking at this massive trade deficit and this unequal trading relationship, we can clearly say that it's very essential for India to attain self-sufficiency and promote an export and manufacturing oriented economy. There is no doubt that addressing this trade deficit is an economic imperative for India, but calling for the boycott of Chinese products as a response to border incidents is going to be self-defeating for India, especially in a globalized world. See, India has been one of the biggest beneficiaries of the era of globalization. By integrating its economy with the global supply chains, India has managed to generate massive economic growth over the last 25 odd years. But the dependency that it has built on Chinese manufacturing is largely a result of the failure of India's manufacturing and Indian exports. This failure of India can be attributed to its failure in developing the skill set of its workforce, its failure to develop adequate modern infrastructure, its failure to reform labor laws and come out with stable policies. These are the areas where China has gained an advantage over the last 20 to 30 years, and it has managed to attract massive amounts of FDI, which has allowed China to establish itself as a manufacturing hub and make most of the countries, including India, to be excessively dependent on its supply chains. Experts believe that any attempt to cut down this dependency at one go as a part of a nationalistic response is going to be self-defeating, and it is bound to cause more harm to the Indian economy than the Chinese economy. Take for example India's pharmaceutical sector. See, India happens to be one of the world's largest producer of generic drugs. But India's production of generic drugs is directly dependent on the APIs or the active pharmaceutical ingredients that we import from China. And for Indian drug manufacturers, it is not going to be easy to find an alternative overnight to these Chinese APIs, and any such short-sighted attempt is going to affect the Indian economy itself. Similarly, critical sectors of the Indian economy such as telecom, electronics, mobile phones, electricity, etc., they are excessively dependent on China's manufacturing capabilities. To take away this dependency overnight is neither feasible nor logical, because it will only push India down the path of protectionism, economic nationalism, and this would lead to isolation of the Indian economy, not just from the Chinese economy, but possibly from the global economy as well. So if India really has to address this trade imbalance, and if it has to reduce its dependency on the Chinese economy, then it needs to focus on long-term goals, such as achieving self-sufficiency in its exports and manufacturing through stable economic policies, which will promote the skill set of its workforce, which will help in creating state-of-the-art infrastructure, which will provide for flexible and stable laws that can help attract investments in critical manufacturing sectors. Now let's take up the next article. The government of India has announced the launch of a 50,000 crore rupee scheme for migrant workers known as the Garib Kalyan Rojgar Abhiyan. This scheme is all set to be launched tomorrow by the Prime Minister, and it is intended to provide immediate employment opportunities for migrant workers who have returned back to their villages as a result of the lockdown. According to estimates of the central government and the state governments, nearly 1 crore migrant workers in the country have returned, and a majority of them have returned to around 116 districts that are spread across 6 states. So this employment generation scheme has been designed to benefit the migrant workers who have returned to their villages in these states, and the beneficiary states include Bihar, Jharkhand, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Odisha and Rajasthan. Under this scheme, the central government will make use of the allocated 50,000 crore rupees, and it will work with the state governments and the local administration in order to carry out various public works in these selected 116 districts. And as per the proposal, public works such as rural housing, rural connectivity under the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, the building of national highways and railway works, the construction of community sanitation complex, the construction of Gram Panchayats and Anganwadi centers, the implementation of water conservation, plantation and horticulture initiatives, etc. would be taken up. Such specific public works would be taken up in these identified districts, and work would be allocated to migrant workers based on their respective skill sets. So in order to implement this scheme effectively, the central government has worked along with the state governments and have meticulously mapped out the skill set of the migrant workers who have returned back to their villages. So based on their skill set, appropriate work would be allocated to them under these projects. But a great deal of coordination would be required amongst 12 central ministries in order to implement the program effectively. This scheme will see coordination between 12 central ministries, including the Ministry of Rural Development, the Ministry of Panchayati Raj, the Ministry of Road Transport, the Ministry of Highways, Ministry of Mines, Ministry of Drinking Water, Sanitation, Environment, Railways, Petroleum and Natural Gas, New and Renewable Energy, Border Roads, Telecom, Agriculture, etc. From the 20th of June, the scheme will be implemented for a period of 125 days in mission mode, and it is expected to not only create immediate employment opportunities for the migrant workers who have returned as a result of the lockdown, but it is also expected to help create rural infrastructure. Now let's take up the next article. The Central Drug Research Institute, which is a part of CSIR, is going to conduct clinical trials of Umifenovir in order to establish its effectiveness in treating COVID-19 patients. See, Umifenovir is an antiviral drug which is popularly used in Russia and China to treat influenza. This antiviral drug has acquired a lot of prominence of late because of its potential usage in treating COVID-19 patients. So in order to verify the effectiveness and safety of this drug, the Central Drug Research Institute is going to conduct clinical trials. Now let's take up an article from page number 14, which refers to an emerging conflict between the United States and France. This conflict is related to the proposed imposition of a digital tax on US-based big tech companies that have been clubbed into an acronym known as GAFA. GAFA stands for Google, Apple, Facebook and Amazon. These 4 American technology companies stand accused by a number of European countries such as the United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, France and even Germany for unfairly exploiting the taxation rules in European countries in order to avoid paying taxes to these governments by declaring their profits in low tax havens such as Liechtenstein, Cayman Islands, etc. These US-based big tech companies are known to avoid taxes by declaring their profits in such low tax havens. So according to these countries, this is an unfair exploitation of their taxation rules, which is depriving them of precious revenue. Hence, in the month of January, around 137 countries had met under the OECD and they had negotiated a deal to impose a digital tax on these companies. In fact, countries such as Spain, Italy and the United Kingdom have already imposed these taxes, and now France has made a similar proposal and it is looked to push for the implementation of this digital tax at the OECD level by the end of this year. So this proposal of France has been objected to by the US government as it believes that these proposals unfairly target American technology companies. Now let's take up the practice questions for the day. The Russia-India-China Trilateral Summit is held as a part of BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SAARC, or none of the above. The correct answer is option D, none of the above. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 10, India will be taking part in the upcoming RIC Trilateral Summit, even though border tensions have increased significantly between India and China. Now let's take up the next practice question. The Rule of Law Index is brought out by the World Justice Project. Option B is the right answer. See, rule of law is nothing but the supremacy of law and its equal application to governments, to institutions, and the citizens. According to the World Justice Project, rule of law can be defined on the basis of 4 universal principles. This includes the government and its officials being held accountable under the law, the provision of clear-cut, well-publicized, stable and fair laws that protect the fundamental rights of the citizens and the security of the citizens from the state. It is also determined by the process through which these laws are enacted and administered. If the process that is followed, if it is free, fair, efficient and accessible, then we can say that rule of law is being upheld in a particular country. Then it also depends on the competency of the judiciary and its ability to uphold ethical values. So these are some of the principles which define rule of law, and the World Justice Project comes out with the Rule of Law Index in order to measure as to what extent rule of law is being upheld in various countries. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 10 that makes a reference to the Rule of Law Index. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are incorrect? The historic Puri temple is dedicated to Lord Shiva. It is located at the foothills of Himalayas. Many great saints such as Ramananda and Ramanuja were closely associated with the temple. Amongst the given statements, the first and the second statements are incorrect. So the correct answer is option B, 1 and 2 only, because the question is asking you to identify the incorrect statements. See, the historic Puri temple is dedicated to Lord Jagannath, a form of Lord Vishnu. And this temple is located in Odisha on the east coast of India and not at the foothills of Himalayas. The temple is known for its popular Rath Yatra, and many great saints such as Ramananda of the Bhakti movement and Ramanuja, the chief proponent of the Vishishtadvaita philosophy, were closely associated with the temple. So this makes the third statement correct. This question has been asked because on page number 11 we have an article which refers to the refusal of the Supreme Court to allow the Puri Rath Yatra to be carried out as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Asian Development Bank has restricted its membership to Asian countries alone. China and India hold the largest proportion of shares at the ADB. ADB is an official UN observer. Amongst the given statements, the first and the second statements are incorrect, so option C is the right answer. See, membership to ADB has not been restricted to Asian countries alone. You also have non-regional members such as the United States, Australia, and a number of other European countries as well. And the second statement is incorrect because the largest shareholders at the ADB are Japan and the United States, whereas China is at the third position and India is at the fourth position. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 15, the ADB has predicted the Indian economy to contract by 4% in 2020-21 as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown. Now let's take up the next practice question. Kodumanal in Tamil Nadu is an important archaeological site. As per inscriptions found in Sangam literature, Kodumanal was an important agrarian center with warehousing and granary facilities, a major trading point in Indo-Roman trade, located midway between the Muziris port on the Malabar coast with the Kaveri Poopattinam port on the Coromandel coast. An important industrial center where highly skilled craftsmen specialized in making beads and high quality iron? The correct answer is option D. Both B and C are correct. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 16 which makes a reference to Kodumanal. See, Kodumanal is an important archaeological site that is located near the Erode district of Tamil Nadu, and it is located on the banks of the Noyal River, which is a tributary of the Kaveri. Archaeological excavations and inscriptions in the Sangam literature have revealed that Kodumanal was a very important trading and industrial point. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2019 prelims paper. Which of the following adopted a law on data protection and privacy for its citizens, known as General Data Protection Regulation, in April 2016 and started implementation of it from 25th May 2018? The correct answer is option C, the European Union. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: India's election to the UN Security Council as a non-permanent member is a significant diplomatic victory for the country, which has long been pushing for reforms at global institutions. Examine how India can use this opportunity to emerge as a champion of South-South cooperation and be the voice of the weaker nations. The second question: the government of India has repeatedly hiked fuel prices of late, even though global oil prices have declined to a historic low. This brings in additional revenue to the government, but it comes at the expense of people relying entirely on private transport. Evaluate. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.